is not a battle. This is an ending.
This is the end of the dream, 71 BC. For 2 years, one man has done the impossible. He has taken the vilest, most disposable refuse of the Roman world, slaves, gladiators, the condemned, and forged them into an army that has humiliated the Republic. He has defeated consuls, shattered legions, and burned his way across the Italian peninsula. His name is Spartacus, and this, the Battle of the Siler River, is his final dawn. Across the field, his nemesis waits. Not a consul, not a politician, but the richest man in the world. A man who understands that power is not just won, it is bought. And he has paid for this war in blood, his own soldiers' blood. His name is Marcus Licinius Crassus, and he is here not just to win a war, but to liquidate an asset, to foreclose on a rebellion, and to send a message to the world so brutal it will echo for millennia. This is the story of the final desperate clash between the man who had nothing to lose and the empire that had everything. This is Spartacus versus Rome. To understand the sheer, earth-shattering finality of this battle, you must first understand the two men at its epicenter. They were not just commanders, they were symbols, mirror images of their worlds. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the Roman 1%. His wealth was legendary, built from the ashes of civil war, buying the estates of the proscribed and running a private fire brigade that would only put out a fire after the owner sold the burning building to him for pennies. He was a master of capital, but he lacked the one thing a Roman aristocrat truly craved: dignitas, military glory. While his rival Pompey the Great was conquering Spain and earning triumphs, Crassus was seen as a mere vulture, a landlord. This rebellion was his chance, but it had become a personal humiliation. Praetors and consuls had failed. Spartacus was laughing at them. So when the Senate, in a panic, gave Crassus command of 8 legions, he did something unthinkable. He revived the ancient, terrifying punishment of decimatio. After one of his legions broke in combat, he forced the cohort to draw lots, and every 10th man was beaten to death by his own comrades. The message was clear: Crassus was more to be feared than the enemy. His own men were now terrified into perfect mechanical obedience. He was not just fighting Spartacus, he was fighting for his political life, determined to crucify this slave king before Pompey could return and steal his thunder. And then there was the slave king himself. We know so little about Spartacus. He was a Thracian, perhaps an auxiliary soldier who deserted, or a captive sold into slavery. He was trained at the Ludus of Capua, a school for gladiators, men bred to die for entertainment. In 73 BC, he and 70 other gladiators broke out with kitchen knives. What followed was a miracle. They repelled the local militia. They set up camp on Mount Vesuvius. When a praetor besieged them, Spartacus had his men weave vines into ropes and rappel down the other side of the volcano, flanking and annihilating the Roman force. Suddenly, he was a symbol. Slaves from across Italy flocked to his banner. He was not just a brawler, he was a strategic genius. He understood Roman tactics. He understood logistics. He created a mobile nation of over 100,000 people, defeating consular armies one after another. But his nation was built on fault lines. He wanted to lead his people out of Italy, over the Alps to freedom in Gaul or Thrace. Many of his followers, particularly the Gauls under Crixus, wanted to stay and plunder. They wanted revenge. This division was the beginning of the end. Crixus and his army split off and were cornered and destroyed by Roman legions. Spartacus, in a gesture of grim mourning, forced 300 Roman prisoners to fight to the death as gladiators at Crixus's funeral, a stark reversal of the arena. The 2 years of war had been a desperate running fight. Spartacus had marched north to the Alps, then inexplicably turned south again. Perhaps his army refused to leave. Perhaps he believed he could ignite a wider revolt. He marched to the very toe of Italy, to Bruttium, with a new desperate plan to cross the Strait of Messina into Sicily. Sicily was the tinderbox of the Republic, home to 2 previous massive slave wars. If he could land his veteran army there, the entire island would explode, giving him a true kingdom. He paid pirates to transport his army, but they took the money and, in a betrayal that sealed his fate, sailed away. And that is when Crassus arrived. Seeing Spartacus trapped in the peninsula, Crassus undertook one of the most staggering feats of Roman engineering. He built a wall. From coast to coast, across the toe of Italy, his legions dug a ditch and built a rampart of stone and timber nearly 45 kilometers long. It was a fortress wall not to keep people out, but to keep Spartacus in. As winter set in, the rebel army began to starve. They were caged. The dream was dead, but Spartacus had one last miracle. On a dark, snowy night, he launched a concentrated assault on one section of the wall. He had his men fill the ditch, not with dirt, but with the bodies of prisoners, cattle, and anything they could find. In a night of horrific close-quarters combat, a fraction of his army punched through the line and escaped. It was a tactical victory, but a strategic disaster. He had broken out, but into what? He was in Apulia with Crassus's legions, now furious and reinforced, closing in from the south. And worse, Pompey's legions had just landed in the north, returning from Spain. Spartacus was now caught between the 2 most powerful armies in the Republic. His back was to the Siler River. There was no escape. No more tricks, no more mountains to hide on. The Gauls and Germans in his army, under their leaders Gannicus and Castus, split off in a final act of internal division, and Crassus found them, annihilating them in a separate, bloody engagement. All that was left was Spartacus and his corps of Thracian veterans. They were exhausted, starving, and cornered. The end had come. The morning of the battle was cold and wet. Spartacus, knowing this was the end, did 2 things that would become legend. First, he captured a Roman prisoner and had him crucified in the no-man's land between the 2 armies. It was a final, horrifying message to his own men. This is the fate that awaits you if you are captured. There is no surrender. There is no mercy. Fight for a free death. Second, they brought him his horse. Spartacus looked at the animal, drew his sword, and plunged it into the horse's neck, killing it instantly. He turned to his stunned commanders and said, "If I am victorious today, I shall have many horses, a gift from the enemy. If I am defeated, I shall not need one." He would fight on foot as a common soldier, shoulder to shoulder with his men. He was no longer a general king. He was a gladiator, one last time, in the largest arena in the world. And then, the sound. The Roman tubae and cornua blared, a deep, brazen call to slaughter. Crassus's 8 legions, tens of thousands of men, advanced not as a charge, but as a relentless, disciplined tide of iron. The first wave of pila, heavy iron-tipped javelins, darkened the sky and thudded into the rebel line, shattering shields and punching through armor. Then the rebels charged. It was not a disciplined advance, it was an inferno of rage. Men who had been property, who had been whipped and branded, who had seen their families sold, slammed into the Roman shields with a primal scream. The clang of steel was deafening as the Roman gladius, the short stabbing sword, began its methodical, brutal work. The Romans, fighting in their checkerboard maniple formation, were fresh. They could rotate their front lines, pulling back tired men for fresh ones. The rebels had no such luxury. They had only their courage and their desperation. In the center of this chaos, Spartacus had one singular goal. He was not trying to win the battle. He was trying to win the war by cutting off the head of the snake. He formed a small, elite bodyguard, his most trusted warriors, and began to cut a bloody path directly toward one man, Crassus. The Roman historian Appian tells us that Spartacus was a whirlwind of fury. He was not a general directing traffic from a hill. He was the first man in the fight. He cut down 2 centurions with his own hand. He was wounded by a javelin that pierced his thigh, forcing him to one knee, but he did not stop. Propped up on his shield, he continued to fight, a bleeding, screaming demigod, still trying to get to the man who represented all of Rome. But the legionaries were a sea of steel. They collapsed on him. They were terrified of this one man. They overwhelmed him with numbers, stabbing and cutting from every direction. And then he was gone. Spartacus, the man who had defied an empire, was swallowed by the machine. He was cut into so many pieces that when the battle was over, his body was never found. The moment Spartacus fell, the rebel line did not just break, it dissolved. The courage that had been held together by his presence alone evaporated into panic. The battle became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. The legionaries, unleashed by Crassus, showed no mercy. They pursued the fleeing slaves for miles, cutting them down by the thousand. The Siler River, it was said, ran red with the blood of the rebellion. But the horror was not over. Crassus had won his total victory, but his victory had to have a meaning. He had to re-establish the terrifying absolute order of the Roman world. He rounded up every survivor he could find, 6,000 men, and he gave one last terrible order. The Appian Way, the Via Appia. This was the great road that led from Rome to Capua, the very city where the rebellion had begun. Crassus marched his 6,000 prisoners back to this road and began a methodical industrial process of execution. He erected 6,000 wooden crosses, and one by one he had the survivors of Spartacus's army nailed to them. The crosses were spaced out, one every 30 or 40 meters, lining both sides of the road. For over 120 miles, from the gates of Rome to the gates of Capua, travelers were forced to walk through an avenue of the dying. It was the most terrible warning in history. It was Rome saying, "You are not human, you are property." And this is what happens to property that disobeys. The men were left to rot. For weeks, then months, the stench of death hung over the road. It was a monument to Roman power, more potent than any arch or temple. Crassus had his victory. He had ended the war. And then, the ultimate insult. Pompey the Great, his rival, intercepted a small band of 5,000 rebels fleeing north. He annihilated them and immediately sent a dispatch to the Senate claiming, "Crassus, it is true, defeated the gladiators in open battle, but I, Pompey, have torn out the very roots of the war." The Senate, fawning over its hero, granted Pompey a triumph, while Crassus, because he had fought mere slaves, was given only a lesser ovation. It was a bitter pill that would define the animosity between the two men for decades, eventually leading to the first triumvirate and the end of the Republic itself. So why do we remember Spartacus? He lost. He failed. His army was exterminated. His dream of freedom was crucified along the Appian Way. We remember him because he almost won. We remember him because he took the very concept of the Roman world, the rigid, unshakable order of master and slave, and he shattered it for 2 terrifying, glorious years. He proved that the most powerful empire on earth was vulnerable. But perhaps most importantly, we remember him because his body was never found. Rome was denied its final prize. They could not parade his head through the forum. They could not put his corpse on display. By being cut to pieces, by vanishing back into the mud of Italy, Spartacus defied Rome one last time. He denied them his body, and in doing so, he became a myth. He became an idea. And an idea, unlike a man, can never be killed, crucified, or buried. It can only wait patiently for the next spark to set the world on fire. The Third Servile War was over. Rome was safe. The immediate cost of the rebellion was catastrophic, but the ultimate cost to the Republic was even greater. The rivalry between Crassus and Pompey, sharpened by this very war, would fester. Along with Julius Caesar, they would form the triumvirate that ultimately strangled the Roman Republic, replacing it with the very autocracy it feared. The fire Spartacus started did burn Rome, just not in the way he intended. The rebellion itself failed. The 6,000 crosses on the Appian Way served their brutal purpose, and for centuries the name Spartacus was a word of terror, a warning to any who dared challenge the order of things. But history has a long memory. Today, Crassus is remembered as a footnote, a symbol of greedy ambition. Pompey is a tragic figure, a stepping stone for Caesar. But Spartacus, his name is no longer a warning, it is an anthem. He was claimed by Enlightenment thinkers, by revolutionaries in France and Haiti, and by Karl Marx as a true hero of the proletariat. He proved that the system was not inevitable. He proved that the disposable could become undeniable. He lost everything, his war, his men, his life, his very body. But in doing so, he became one of the most powerful symbols of resistance the world has ever known. The gladiator who died on his feet, fighting not just for survival, but for the simple, impossible right to be free. But what do you think? Was Spartacus a heroic freedom fighter, or was he a brutal terrorist as Rome saw him? Was his final, hopeless charge an act of tactical suicide, or the only honorable death left to him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The story of Rome is filled with these epic conflicts, from the brothers Gracchi fighting for the people, to the civil wars that forged an empire. If there's another figure, or another desperate last stand from the ancient world you want to see us bring to life, tell us. Thank you.